Hello again, friends. I am Steve Taylor, one of the illustrious crew at fthatnoisepod.com. I'm continuing my series, Steve Attempts to Read. I'm reading my first novel, The Lockbox. Right now we are covering chapters 12 and 13. There's only two more to go after this. This and all the previous videos you can find streaming on both YouTube and at our website, fthatnoisepod.com. There is also a link on my personal website, staylorbooks.com. And if you do enjoy listening to me drone on about these great stories, please like my YouTube channel. You'll be able to see all the previous videos plus all future ones, because after we're done with the Lockbox, we're going to move into me reading Homecoming, and then hopefully soon we'll be able to have me reading the third book in the series once I finally decide to finish it, Mama. As always, this video and all other content will be brought to you by Trashman Media. Trashman Media for the latest home video reviews of films you may not see in your local Redbox. Visit them at trashmanmedia.com. Also brought to you by Bizarre Abyss, the site dedicated to news and straight talk. Visit them at bizarreabyss.com. And don't forget to check out the #1 podcast among all the most intelligent people on planet Earth, F That Noise. Check us out every Monday night at fthatnoisepod.com. And parents, the podcast is not for young ears. It is raunchy, it is adult, and it is fantastic. So please check it out. And once again, if you enjoy what you're hearing with both the Lockbox and then Homecoming, which once again I'll start reading, I think in 2 weeks, please go to staylorbooks.com. There's a link to the amazon.com page for both books, and you have the option of getting either the paperback or the digital versions. And I know I'm biased, but they are fantastic. All right, no further ado, we're going to go on to chapter 12. It is getting very exciting. Saber stood atop his perch, the RPG-7V still smoked in his hand. After he had seen Anton evaporate into a wall of flame, he had decided his side needed to become the aggressors. He had loaded one of the thermobaric rounds into his RPG and unloaded onto the side of Building 3. Needless to say, the weapon produced the desired effect. The entire south side of Building 3 now lay in ruin. The explosion had been so intense its shockwave almost knocked him from his position. Immediately after the explosion, Saber called for the men to open fire on the complex. Holger and Amund drove their vehicle up to the side of the Building 1 and began to tear into it with the 50 cal. The rounds tore through the siding like it was paper. Each round had the potential to travel the length of the complex with deadly accuracy, and from their position it was ideal for them to remain safe against any unexpected retaliation. On cue, Frank and Tao also targeted the smoking building with their weapons. The roar of gunfire was deafening. Saber knew that the explosion would soon draw the attention of the local authorities, so this needed to conclude as soon as possible. Break. The smoke had begun to clear as Sam regained consciousness. He was covered in soot and rock, and to his horror, he heard nothing save for a loud ringing in his ears. As he looked around at the devastation, he could see Joe and Gerald rushing about, each man now wildly firing large weapons he thought might be AK-47s. Sam began to sit up when he realized that his legs were stuck under a sheet of metal from the roof. The sheet had crushed his right ankle and broke at least one bone in his left leg. Now that his mind was beginning to clear, the pain of his injuries overwhelmed him as he let out a scream of pure agony. The shout drew the attention of Emily, who was lost in the cloud of smoke. Emerging from the veil of debris, she flopped down next to him and began to shout for help. Sam just looked at her mouth as she screamed, hearing nothing but the awful ringing. "Emily!" he shrieked. She shook him and began to speak a mile a minute. "I can't hear," he shouted, pointing at his legs. Sam yelled, "Help me lift the metal!" She shook her head in acknowledgement and grabbed the side of the metal. She raised 3 fingers and shook them at him. "Count of 3?" Sam held back, understanding her intent. Emily lowered 1, then 2, and finally the 3rd finger. With as much strength as they could muster, the two lifted the metal with all of their might. At first it didn't budge, but after a second it began to shift. As Emily strained, the metal shifted enough for Sam to slide himself out from under his prison. As soon as he was free, a second explosion tore through the building. Emily dropped the metal sheet and rushed to Sam's side. Grabbing him under the arm, she dragged him behind the now bullet-ridden shell of the taxicab. Sam continued to howl in agony. His twisted legs were now covered in blood and dirt. Moments later, Ethan appeared out of the dark, his wounded shoulder now seeping blood. What happened? Emily pointed to the large metal sheet. A piece of the ceiling collapsed on Sam's legs. I think he's hurt real bad. Ethan looked at Sam's injuries and took quick stock of the situation. I'll be right back, he shouted as he turned and fled back towards the door, remaining low as bullets continued to fly over his head. Emily looked on in disbelief as Ethan disappeared around the side of the cab. Panicked, she pleaded for Ethan to stay. Don't leave us! Now alone again, she covered Sam as the building was being destroyed all around them. To her relief, only a few seconds passed before Ethan reappeared with Joe. The men crouched next to Sam and Joe gave his wounds a quick scan. He had the red bag with him, and after surveying the scene, he began to rummage through it. Removing a large syringe and a vial of morphine, he filled the syringe with fluid and jammed the needle into Sam's arm. It only took a moment for the liquid to do its work. The shaking and screaming stopped, and Sam's body went limp. Joe checked Sam's pulse and looked up at the others. Pointing to a door 5 feet behind them, Joe barked at the ground. He's stable. We need to move him into the bathroom. Emily grabbed Joe's arm and shouted so he could hear her. But what if the building collapses? It won't matter. Either way, we're all dead. He has a better shot if we lay him in the tub. It's cast iron and can withstand a lot of abuse. Emily reluctantly agreed with Joe's logic and helped the two men carry Sam's now lifeless body into the bathroom. As they shut the door, Gerald rushed over to them. His right eye was covered with a patch and some gauze. A deep scratch peeked out from beneath the bandage. He held his AK-47 close to his chest. The barrel glowed red from the strain of the firefight. Breathing heavily, he pointed towards the now gaping hole in the wall. There is someone on the south wall with a grenade launcher and two men in the north tree line with machine guns. The 50 cal rounds are coming from the west. I don't know how many there are. Joe slapped the brick wall. When I built this place, I reinforced the walls with steel, so barring any further rocket attacks, it should hold for a few more minutes. Ethan ducked as a bullet ricocheted off the wall above his head. Screw that! We can't hold out much longer. We need a plan. Joe crouched and ran over to the cab. He smacked the trunk with it sprung open. Inside was every weapon you could imagine. AK-47s, MAC-10s, old Thompson submachine guns, M249 saw machine guns, 50 cal Desert Eagles, and more advanced weaponry than Gerald didn't even recognize. Grinning with pride over his collection, Joe began to distribute the armaments. Grab as much as you can carry, Joe commanded as he pulled an M16 and multiple grenades out of the trunk. It's time we said hi to our guests. Break. It had been 8 minutes since the initial attack, and Sabre was growing impatient. The structures surrounding Building 3 were destroyed, but Building 3 was annoyingly resilient. He had to wonder if it was reinforced with something. Lowering the RPG, he picked up his radio and called to his men. Cease fire, he shouted into the mouthpiece. All at once, the deafening sound of their weapons had stopped. Raising his binoculars, Sabre surveyed the damage, looking for any sign of life. Holger, is there any movement on your end? No, sir. Tau, do you have eyes on any survivors? That's a negative, sir. We haven't seen anything since we began firing. There was some small arms fire, but nothing of consequence. After giving the compound one last look, Sabre put down the binoculars and keyed the radio again. Tau, I want you and Frank to move in. Keep low and stand ready for anything. Yes, sir. We are already en route. Sabre looked over to the entrance. Holger, I want you and Amun to pull the truck around the rear of the building and use the winch to clear off some debris. We're on the way, sir. Sabre remained perched on his tower as he watched his men close in for the kill. His pulse began to race as he realized how close they were to finally securing that which so many have had attempted to obtain, but failed. Break. Holger had slowly angled his truck around the corner of what was left of Building 1. As he drove past the rubble of the buildings, he noticed Tau and Frank creeping ever closer to the entrance of the building, their weapons at the ready as they scanned for survivors. He had worked with these men for many years now, and he felt privileged to have been a part of such a prolific team of soldiers. Slowly, he pulled the vehicle directly in front of the massive hole that Saber created with his new toy. Amun kept the barrel of the massive machine gun pointed into the opening as the truck inched to a halt. As Holger began to climb out of the vehicle, a grenade emerged from the dust and crashed through the window of the Humvee. Amun shouted in despair as the truck erupted into a ball of fire. Holger was catapulted through the air and he landed 20 feet away, motionless, his large form now a ball of scorched flesh. Saber looked on in shock as pieces of Amun continued to land over a large area. As he prepared to launch another rocket at the building, the silo was lit up with heavy machine gun fire, forcing him to jump off the back of the tower. The 35-foot drop dazed him for a moment, but he was mostly unharmed. The soil around his position erupted with dust from the relentless barrage of bullets. "I need cover fire ASAP," he shouted into his radio. As Tao and Frank sprinted around the corner of the Building 3, a spray of ammunition forced them to retreat back behind the building. Gerald and Joe had emerged from the structure with machine guns in both hands. The grizzled veterans fired at the targets with lethal accuracy. Ethan and Emily both followed with Sam dangling limp between them. The plan was to make it to an old pickup truck Joe had in the garage just south of where they were. As the old friends laid down cover fire, Ethan and Emily made a break for the small building. They were slowed greatly by Sam's dead weight and Ethan's injured shoulder, but they pressed on as fast as they could. Saber continued to cower behind the silo, waiting for the right moment to strike. Frank and Tao were now returning fire the best they could. Joe and Gerald held a better position and had excellent cover within the ruin of the building. During his leap, Saber lost his RPG and was left with nothing but one hand grenade and his trusty SIG SP 2022 that never left his hip. He pulled the weapon from its holster and prepared for what may be his final stand. As he began to turn towards the oncoming fire, Saber noticed the three fugitives limping towards a small building not 300 feet from his location. At that distance, it was hard to make out who they were, but it appeared to be the children and another man, maybe the sheriff. As he quickly surveyed the group, Saber noticed that all three had backpacks with them. He couldn't be certain, but if one of those bags had the map in it, he needed to stop them from escaping. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small green orb. He stood from his position and flattened his body against the silo to avoid the relentless attack. After calming his breath, he marked off the distance in his head. He pulled the pin on top of the grenade and with all his strength, heaved the small explosive towards its target. Break. Due to their injuries, Joe had decided that Ethan and Sam needed to escape the ambush as soon as possible. As he helped them load the rest of the gear, Joe remembered the small pickup truck that was parked in the garage on the southern part of the property. If Ethan and the kids can make it to the vehicle, they might just make it out alive. It was his intent to have Gerald help him in creating a distraction while Emily and Ethan carried Sam to the vehicle. Ethan put up a fight over the plan, but his protest fell on deaf ears. Joe had made up his mind, and that was that. Gerald, Emily, and Ethan had recovered Sam from the bathtub and staged him near the side door to the complex. Lucky for them, the explosion didn't damage or block the door. Gerald had decided to keep the lockbox with Sam for the time being, just in case he didn't make it out of the ensuing attack. Gerald pulled Ethan aside before beginning his assault. "I need you to make sure the kids make it out safe. I know that my actions have caused all of you terrible pain, and I only hope my sacrifice will give you all the chance at a new life." Ethan shifted his pack off his bad shoulder. "We all lost something, and there isn't anything that will make it better, but I will do my best to make things right by you. It just might take some time. I do have one last request of you, Ethan. You don't want me to take care of that damn box, do you?" "I do. With me and Joe out of the picture, there is no one else I trust this secret with. It's up to you and the kids to keep this treasure a secret from the world." "Why don't you just burn the damn thing? Then nobody will ever know where it was." Gerald grabbed Ethan by the shoulder straps and pulled him closer, causing Ethan to grimace. "That map must not be damaged. If the location was ever discovered, the destruction that would be unleashed is too terrible to fathom. Part of your responsibility is to remain vigilant in keeping an eye on the area surrounding the meteor's location. If it seems like it is in danger of being discovered, you may have to move it." Ethan pulled away from Gerald's grasp. "How the hell do I move something like that without anyone knowing?" Gerald removed a small notebook from his pack and handed it to Ethan. This book includes the code to the box and account numbers with multiple bank accounts around the world. There are also addresses to safe houses all over Europe and Asia, which Joe and I used back in the day. You now have the assets needed to make almost anything happen if you choose. Gerald turned and pointed towards Sam and Emily. And you have the best support system you ever could ask for. Ethan held the small notebook in his hands and thought about the weight of his new responsibilities. Not only was he now the guardian of two emotionally damaged teenagers, he also held the key to one of the most destructive substances on the planet. I guess I really don't have much of a choice, do I? Gerald smiled and slapped Ethan on his good shoulder. Now that's the spirit, young fella. Now let's get this show on the road. As Gerald joined Joe by the large hole in the wall, Ethan rejoined Sam and Emily. What did he want? Emily asked after curiously watching the entire exchange. I really don't want to talk about it. Are you ready to do this? Emily winked at her big brother. As ready as I'll ever be. Together they lifted Sam to his feet and each took an arm in support of the boy. His size and weight were a challenge for them to handle, but the adrenaline now flowing through their veins helped give them the strength they needed. Once they had him secured in place, Emily slid the little notebook into Sam's bag. He wanted all the eggs in one basket. As if on cue, there was a lull in the action outside, so the group used this as a sign to make their move. Gerald and Joe had armed themselves with multiple grenades and rifles. Each man prepared to give their lives for the safety of the children. Joe extended his hand to Gerald. Are you ready, old friend? It's been an honor to serve alongside of you, Joe, Gerald said as he accepted the gesture with his own hand. After a second of silent reassurance, the two men released hands and prepared for battle. Joe carefully removed a grenade from his belt and pulled the pin. He turned to Ethan. As soon as the firing starts, wait a few and then make a break for it. Understood? Good luck, old man. See you at the truck, Ethan said with remorse in his voice. He knew this was quite possibly the end, and he regretted not being able to take a few of the bastards with him. Joe took a deep breath and let the lever go. He threw the ball of death into the sun-lit cloud of dust and debris. The sound of glass breaking was followed by a shriek of terror and a large explosion. Gerald was the first to advance after the blast, his Thompson machine gun roaring a welcome to the intruders. Joe was hot on his heels, his weapon singing in tune with Gerald's. Ethan and Emily couldn't help but be in awe of the two men. Let's go, Ethan shouted as enough time had passed for them to sneak out under the cover of fire. After passing through the door, they were able to clear the building and maneuver around what was left of one of the attackers. A single boot smoldered in the dirt, the foot and lower leg of its owner still inside. They were pushing themselves as much as their legs could take. As the battle raged behind them, Ethan was the first to see the small building Joe had mentioned, and he began to pick up the pace. We're almost there, Sam, Emily said, as much as reassuring herself as she was her brother. The sound of gunfire was beginning to fade into the distance as they inched closer to the target. Ethan was focused forward, but as they neared the building, he turned his attention back to the firefight. It was then that he saw a man in the distance heave a small object in their direction. He didn't need any help understanding what was headed their way. Without saying a word, he shoved Sam and Emily as hard as he could. Both kids rolled off to the side in shock as they were unprepared for the sudden move. As the grenade fell at his feet, Ethan did the only thing he could do to save the kids. With a sudden flop, Ethan collapsed onto the device as it exploded. The force of the blast sent Emily flailing through the air and into a tree, knocking her unconscious. Sam was propelled back into a pile of rocks. His limp form was smoldering from the violent explosion. Break. Joe and Gerald had been occupied with the two men hiding around the corner of the building when the explosion shook them to their core. Joe was the first to turn and see the horrific scene. Emily and Sam both lay motionless. He scanned for Ethan, but there was no trace of him anywhere. Cover me, he yelled to his partner. With Gerald laying down a deadly barrage, Joe sprinted towards the children. As he drew closer to the scene, Joe surveyed the area for the cause of the blast. Just past the silo, he saw a man in black running towards the train tracks. He considered pursuing the man, but changed his mind when he heard a moan emanating from Emily. Rushing to her side, he was grateful to find her semi-conscious but otherwise unharmed. Joe grabbed her arm and pulled her up slowly. Emily, can you move? She rubbed her throbbing head and tried to focus on the situation. Where's Sam? Joe looked over to Sam. He lay motionless on the ground. He's over there, Joe said as he pointed to Sam. You stay here. I'll check on him. Joe sat Emily against the tree she had collided with and began to run towards Sam. After he took his first two steps, he happened to look over at the last spot. He saw the man in black. To his shock, the man now was kneeling, a rocket launcher perched on his shoulder facing their position. "Doc!" he shouted as he turned and dove on top of Emily. There was a brief whizzing sound as the grenade flew over their heads. It exploded between them and Sam, causing a tidal wave of dirt and fire to pour over them. Break. Gerald had continued to keep the others occupied when he felt the shockwave of the explosion. He chanced a quick glance at the source of the blast, not sure what he would find. To his dismay, the remainder of the group was hidden by smoke and earth. Fearing the worst, Gerald let out a primal scream and charged the attackers, still taking cover behind the wall. His sudden aggressive movement surprised them, causing both men to lose focus. Gerald dove for the corner of the building 3, his Thompson peppering the targets with deadly accuracy. He felt the same adrenaline rush he had felt on the cold night 50 years earlier. Frank and Tao never stood a chance. Their bodies shook with each connection, both men taking multiple hits before they finally succumbed to their injuries. Regardless of the fact that they had been neutralized, Gerald continued to unload on their lifeless bodies, his rage flowing through his trigger finger. He continued until the weapon just clicked, his magazine having long since expired. Collecting himself, Gerald looked back towards the site of the blast. From this distance, he was unsure if anyone was alive, but he did see something that caused him alarm. Not 200 yards from their location, a man in black was methodically walking towards the fiery scene. And that is the end of chapter 12. Very exciting, very sad. We are going to miss Ethan. But let's see what happens in chapter 13, shall we? Chapter 13. December 25th, 1963, Toulon, France. It was Christmas morning, and the holiday spirit had taken hold of the Mediterranean town of Toulon. The local children ran through the streets singing songs and playing with the new treasures found under their trees earlier that morning, while the adults began preparing the holiday feast that made the salty sea air smell like heaven on earth. The entire town bustled with cheers of joy and love, except for one family. Tucked away near the coast stood a small seaside villa belonging to the Douay family. Marceline and Brie Douay had lived in Toulon their entire lives. They had met in grade school, and a lifelong romance had blossomed after years of playful flirtation. Marceline was a gifted individual in many ways, and his abilities with firearms would eventually lead him into a life as a marksman in the French Navy during World War II. Upon his safe return from his final post in Berlin, it wasn't long before this decorated soldier would attract the attention of interested parties, one being an organization that used men of his skill set to cause anarchy around the globe. At first, he wasn't sure of the tactics used by his new employer, but he couldn't argue with the money. In one day, he would make as much as he did in a month working the docks near his home. He also found a satisfaction in causing pain to those he deemed evil. This was an unexpected side effect of his work, but also one that made him a more prolific weapon. As his status grew within the organization, his home life was taking a toll, due to the responsibilities that kept him away and his inability to be truthful with Brie over what he actually did with the company. After an unusually long mission in Russia, he returned home and vowed to Brie that their marriage would be his top priority. His employers had decided to be generous with Marceline due to his contributions to the cause, granting him an extended leave from field work. 2 weeks into his return, a miracle happened. After years of trying and many failed attempts, Brie became pregnant with their first child. On February 13th, 1961, a little boy they named Cécile Douay was born. This child was perfect in every way. At the moment of his birth, he didn't even cry. As the doctor pulled him from his mother's womb, Cécile had just looked around at the world with a wide-eyed curiosity. 2 years after his son's birth, Marceline was approached with a delicate mission in America, and it was insinuated that declining wasn't an option. It was early October when he received his orders, and he spent his last days at home playing with Cécile. He hadn't left the boy's side for more than a day since his birth, and the thought of being away for any length of time tortured him. The day of the trip, Marceline kissed his wife and young son goodbye, then boarded a plane for America with 2 of his best men. That was the last time Brie and Cécile would see him alive. Over the next month, Brie received daily calls from Marceline. Each conversation was filled with stories of his trip, and she regaled him with tales of the daily adventure she was having with the young Cécile. In late November, the calls suddenly stopped. Then on Christmas Eve, Brie received a call from Saint-Jean Ames, one of Marceline's friends in the organization. When the phone rang, she knew that something had happened, but the news still devastated her. She was told that Maslin was assaulted while dealing with a dangerous fugitive, and he was murdered during the struggle. In her despondent state, she placed Seal in his crib and eventually that evening and then walked into the ocean. 3 days had passed before anyone noticed that she was gone, her suicide going unnoticed due to her body being washed out to sea. It was St. John who decided to check in on Bree after not being able to reach her for a few days. Upon his arrival, he was stunned to find Seal alone in the dark home he shared with his parents. Other than the boy, it was obvious that no one else had been there for quite some time. St. John collected the hungry child and brought him in to the organization's elders. It was decided that he would be taken care of by the group in honor of Maslin's sacrifice. St. John volunteered to mentor the boy as if he was his own. Over the next 20 years, Seal was instructed by the greatest minds in Europe. He excelled in all forms of study, becoming fluent in multiple languages by the time he was 16. His combat lessons were as intense as anything he learned in the classroom. After basic military training, Seal was taught multiple forms of martial arts as well as firearms and military strategies. It was after his 18th birthday that St. John revealed to Seal the truth behind his parents' death. As expected, he didn't take the news well. A rage began to grow within him from the moment on, and it was about to be unleashed onto the world. Seal completed his training earlier than expected, and he was immediately activated as an agent. It was during his first year in the field that he decided to take his father's middle name as his own, and Saber was born. The next 2 decades were filled with great success for the young agent. He had gained a reputation as not only a cunning intellectual, but also as an unstable psychopath. His main allegiance was to the organization, but he always kept his hope alive that one day he would find the man that took his family from him. Break. Joliet, Illinois, present day. Saber brushed the dirt off of his suit as he walked towards the shard ruins he had just created. His long journey was coming to an end, and it filled him with a peace he hadn't felt for some time. As he approached Joe's motionless body, a bullet grazed his cheek. Turning abruptly, he was not prepared for who he saw pointing a gun at him. Gerald had his 9mm pointed at Saber. The last round he fired emptied the smoking firearm. Exhausted from the battle, Gerald unconsciously kept pulling the trigger on the gun. With each click of the fire pin hitting nothing, it was clear to his opponent that he was helpless. Saber stared at the old man with disbelief. "It's you." Gerald threw his weapon to the ground and pulled a knife from his belt. "Let's go, you son of a bitch. Fight me like a man." Gerald studied his opponent. "I can't believe it's really you." Growing frustration by the inane back and forth, Gerald spit on the ground at Saber's feet. "I don't know who you think I am, but I would remember a piece of garbage like you." "You are correct. We haven't met. But you do know my father. Intimately." Gerald eased up his posturing and squinted in the sun to get a better look at Saber. "Who are you?" "My name is Seal Douay, and you changed my life 50 years ago on a cold night in Oregon. That's the night you killed my father." Gerald froze in his place as he relived that terrible night in his mind. He didn't get a good look at the men he killed that day, but he would never forget the accent of the interrogator, the French accent. His limbs went numb as he realized that his past demons had finally come back to exact their revenge upon him. Sabers raised his firearm and began to unload it into Gerald's chest. Each round carried with it a fury of a child's loss. As Saber pulled the trigger, years of anger and pain over the loss of his parents melted away in a frenzy of emotion. He began to cry as the sound of his maniacal laughter began to drown out the explosion of each round leaving his gun. Gerald's body was propelled through the air and onto the charred earth behind him. As it hit the ground, Saber continued to pull the trigger until the last round was fired. The world around him didn't exist at this moment. It was just him in glorious vengeance. Today was the greatest day of his life. Break. Emily awoke with Saber's first shot, surprised to find Joe's unconscious body sprawled out on top of hers. She knew that he had probably saved her life, but she was unsure if he was alive or dead. She was able to move him enough to get a look around. It was then that she saw the man in black unloading his weapon on Gerald with a feverish intensity. Fearing for the life of her brother, who lay now 2 feet from where Gerald was being brutally executed, Emily fought even harder to move the large man off of her. She struggled with everything she had, but to no avail. Her body was bruised and battered. Her family and friends were all dead, and there was no way that Sam or Gerald could have survived the brutal attack she had just witnessed. Emily had almost given up hope when she heard the man's weapon finally click after the last round was spent. That's when she saw it. Protruding from Joe's coat was the handle of a pistol. With one last desperate heave, Emily moved Joe enough to free up her arm and grab the pistol. As she pulled it free, the madhead turned towards her as he reloaded his weapon. Realizing what she was doing, he became alarmed and raised his gun to fire, but it was too late. Emily squeezed the trigger and unloaded the full magazine into the man's chest. Saber's body shook with subtle tremors as the rounds ripped through his chest. He hit the turf with a large thud and became still after a few more convulsions. Emily continued to point the weapon at what was left of her attacker, her hand clenched around the pistol grip. As her breathing became faster due to shock, she began to hyperventilate. Her head started to pound, the world spun around her, and she slipped into unconsciousness. That is it for Chapter 13, and we are hitting our half hour. Hope you enjoyed it. It's exciting. We've seen a lot of our friends maybe not survive. Maybe they did. Hopefully we can find out next week when I read the final 2 chapters in the book. I believe it'll be chapter 14 and then the epilogue. So once again, if you are enjoying what you're hearing, the Lockbox is available on Amazon.com. Go to staylorbooks.com, click on Other Works, and you'll find the links for the Lockbox. Also check out Homecoming, and I do ask if you do purchase the books, I would hope that you would leave a review on Amazon. Could be good, could be bad. It really doesn't matter to me. The reviews help a lot to help me improve my writing. I don't know if anything will improve my reading, but it'll definitely improve my writing. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.